Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3 Iron, and in today's 15th episode of our weekly featured build discussion series, we are taking a look at a magic find archetype. We're doing something a bit different today as we take a look at a couple of different ways that you can build into a magic find bow user in order to increase the amount of currency that is going to drop for you in the upcoming 3.10 Delirium League. Now, I've got a couple disclaimers as we dive into the path of building for this particular character and go over some of the itemizations and the trees and the skill setups for this particular character. First off, the first thing that I have to say, just because of the timing of this particular discussion, this is not a league starter build, okay? In big, bold letters, don't league start this, okay? League start something different, save up your currency, and then when you want to go bonkers and just make as much of a sink into your character as you possibly can throughout the upcoming league or whatever league it is that you're playing, this character is not friendly to league start. Don't league start this character, build something different, build up a base of currency, and then swap over into this particular character. I do have a couple different trees that we've got set up for your convenience to be able to level with. So if you want to league start something different that is a ranger class and then move over into either a Deadeye, a raider, or a Pathfinder in order to then go farm currency for days using Magic Find, the option and the choice will be there for you provided in the path of building. Of course, as always, you can like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about more video discussions just like this one. And if at any point in time you want to check out any of our particular discussion points, there are some timestamps that are placed above my slightly greedy forehead, and those are down below in the video description along with the path of building for your convenience. Video previews aside and gameplays aside, hopefully you enjoyed a little snippet of what the build looks like in action. This is what that particular character that you just saw is built like. It's a level 91 Deadeye presently, but you can play this as a Pathfinder. You can also play it as a Raider. It just depends on which iteration or which ascendancy that you would like to choose to play on. There's lots of different options when it comes to Magic Find, and that's some of the excitement and some of the joy of choosing and crafting your own spin on a Magic Find character, is that you can really decide what works best for you and then scale into the various choices that you want to make as you fill out your character. The hallmark of almost every single type of Magic Find character out there presently is the Wind Ripper Imperial Bow. I wanted to take just a moment just to focus in on the Wind Ripper because this is, of course, the hallmark of the build. And if you don't have a Wind Ripper, then I would say take the time to farm yourself a Wind Ripper because it will make a massive difference in the whole rest of your build. So what a Wind Ripper does in terms of farming quantity or rarity is that you get 15% increased quantity of items dropped by slaying frozen enemies and 30% increased rarity of items dropped by slaying shocked enemies. The vast majority of Magic Find builds out there are focused more on quantity of items dropped, and we'll get into that in just a moment, but this is the build enabling weapon that you are going to be using. So making a choice for your character is really going to depend on whether or not you are building for increased item rarity or increased item quantity. When we're talking about item rarity or item quantity, the abbreviation for these particular terms in Path of Exile lingo is IIR or IIQ. Vast majority of players want IIQ, and you might be wondering why. Well, IIR, increased item rarity, gives you more chance to drop magic, rare, or unique items. So, the vast majority of the time, players aren't necessarily interested in target farming those specific types of item drops. However, increased item quantity increases the amount of drops from monsters. So this includes currency, scrolls, skill gems, and divination cards. This means in the future when Path of Exile 2 comes out and we're all hunting for 6 linked gems, the vast majority of players who are going to be hunting for those things are going to be using increased item quantity. Presently, whenever you're target farming a particular divination card, you are using increased item quantity. Presently, when you are trying to get simply pure currency to drop, whether that's exalts, whether that's divines, whether that's chaos, you are using increased item quantity. There are some circumstances that some players like to farm using increased item rarity, but the vast majority of the time, IIQ is what you're looking for. So with IIQ being the thing that you're looking for, there's a couple of hallmarks that run across the board in most Magic Find builds. These staples are going to be Sadima's Touch, which grants you upwards of 10% increased quantity of items found. Also on your boots, the gold worm boots are of course another staple because they give you both increased movement speed as well as increased quantity of items found. Now, between these two items in particular, you'll notice that there's not a lot else that's helpful. There's not life on there, there's not a ton of resistances. Goldworm has got a little bit of fire resistance, and Sedima's Touch grants you a little bit of lightning damage and fire damage to attacks, but whoopee, that's hardly build enabling. These are particular items that you are going to use as you are building and flushing out your character to get as much increased item quantity as possible. They are not necessarily going to be something that you're going to slap on as you're leveling and expect to take out bosses in a fast fashion. So the recipe for success, and by the way, these are all notes that are attached to the POB, so whenever you go and take a look at the POB, if you want to reference these notes for yourself, these are all included in the POB, so that way you can just read them for yourself whenever you're referencing and building out your character. The recipe for success when you are building a Magic Find character is typically this. First off, you want to level your character to the desired level. Usually for me, I don't want to swap over to Magic Find until I'm 85 plus, because a lot of the time when you are actually Magic Finding, you are not going to have a ton of resistances and you will just die, all right? This particular character that I'm playing on right now, his defenses, do you guys have phones, right? His defenses are at 10% fire resistance, 10% cold resistance, and 2% lightning resistance with negative 45% chaos resistance. That being said, for the type of content that I'm going to be relentlessly and continuously farming, it doesn't really matter much. I'm very rarely, if ever, going to be putting myself in danger, but if I am putting myself in danger, I want to make sure that my character does enough damage to blow everything up. I have lots and lots of layers of dodge and a chance to evade, and then on top of that, you're probably not going to level very often once you hit level 85, and you do occasionally die, even in non-rippy zones. You might actually get a few levels here or there. I've been surprised in the past where I've accidentally dinged a level while I'm Magic Finding, but those are some stretches where you're basically getting lucky and not dying. This is not necessarily something that you should plan on. So as you're leveling your character up to the desired level of whenever it is that you're going to swap over to Magic Find, let's say 85 for sake of discussion, you're going to want to level up your main gems for your Magic Find swap into your offhand as soon as possible. So for instance, there's a whole lot of players who want to league start with a particular subset of weapons or items or gems that they simply know are reliable and something that they can repeat. That's great. Level up using that as your actives, and then in your offhand, make sure that you're leveling up your new main gems that you'll be using for your Magic Find swap. So for instance, the traditional Magic Find main damage skill is going to be a combination of Tornado Shot and Herald of Ice. So make sure that you're leveling up Herald of Ice and Tornado Shot in your offhand as you're leveling up your character. Also, you'll want to, of course, select a character that is either the same ascendancy that you are eventually going to endgame version your Magic Find character as, or you are going to play another character that is a ranger, for instance, if you're following this guide, and then you're going to be able to swap over your character from one ascendancy to another very, very easily. So you need to make sure that you've got the knowledge on how to reascend your character, and you need to make sure that you've got a base of currency, enough regret orbs to be able to swap your character over. So if you're league starting with this particular method, I highly recommend that you simply choose a particular ascendancy to level with that is also going to be the same ascendancy that you choose to play as a Magic Find character. Luckily for you, we've got 3 different trees and 3 different options inside the Ranger class, so you can Magic Find whether that's as a Deadeye, whether that's as a Raider, or whether that's a Pathfinder. Whatever league start character you choose to play as, you will be able to continue eventually as a Magic Find character. Once you do reach that desired level and readiness to swap over to Magic Find gear, then you want to start swapping on as much equipment as you possibly can. I typically swap over my gloves and my boots first, getting that Sedima's Touch in for 10% quant, and then Gold Rim for 20% quant, along with move speed. And then I'm going to swap over in my chest piece, either a Queen of the Forest if I'm going for a Zoom Zoom speed build, or Greed's Embrace if I just want to absolutely min-max the amount of item quantity or item rarity that I'm going for. In the rings and the amulet slot, we've actually got a little bit of a discussion about some points of comparison, so we'll get back to those in just a minute. Of course, in your main weapon slot is going to be the Wind Ripper. When you're on a 5 link, you can do low-level map farming, no problem, and then you can spend whatever amount of currency it's going to take, whether you're rolling your own fusings or simply purchasing a 6 link Wind Ripper for yourself later on when you want to get into higher tier farming as your build continues to fill out. Lastly, of course, is the belt, which is, of course, the great debate of all Magic Find. Well, it's one of the great debates within the Magic Find community. Do you want to go with, let's say, a Headhunter, or do you want to use Rampage, or do you just want to get some additional quantity? So we'll chat more about that in just a moment. Thirdly, as you continually start to swap your character over into Magic Find mode, you're going to want to select layouts that has both a pleasing layout and a rewarding layout. You need the layout to be a pleasing layout to you in your maps because you're going to be running a ton of these particular maps. Now, with every single update to the Atlas, there are new strategies that are coming out in order to be able to sustain a particular map. But one thing that you can be sure of, regardless of whatever Atlas strategy is out there, you can always just go and buy bulk maps of a particular layout that you want to run and just run those maps. That's what I do when I am running and participating in our series, Let's Run 100 Maps. I just go out and buy 100 maps of whatever it is that particular map layout is going to be that we're going to farm, and I'd run my tests that way. It's a lot cheaper and a lot less time consuming for me to just go out and buy those maps in bulk than it is for me to set up an entire Atlas strategy around 100 maps for one map and then do it again and do it again and do it again. It's just too much hassle to reset up an Atlas strategy when we've got the option to simply go out and trade in a trade league. The second part of this component, of course, on top of being a layout that is pleasing, is also a layout that is rewarding. So you need to have a layout that either consistently drops you either a card or an item that you can sell in bulk and find it to be rewarding. In other words, it's got a consistent drop rate that you know is going to be reliable and you're going to be making money essentially every single map that you run or every couple of maps that you run. Or it needs to be a very, very high value card that is incredibly rare and is going to pay off for all of the other times that that card or that item doesn't drop. So essentially, if you're farming burial chambers for doctor's cards versus if you're farming something that's a bit more consistent, but also less valued. Time for some points of comparison. And thankfully, like any good Path of Exile discussion, we've got a whole lot of them. So first off, would you rather have Rampage, more increased item quantity, or have a Headhunter? Those are three options that you've got in your belt slot. You can, of course, gain speed and flat damage off of Rampage, which is, of course, a budget option through Bisco's Leash. For those of you who don't know what Rampage does for you, we've got an entire video discussion about how to activate Rampage and how to get it. The too long don't watch version of it is that you get speed and some increased damage, and it scales up as an effect as you kill more and more monsters. So it's kind of like a ramped up version, hence Rampage, of a way to get your build going from the time you enter into a map until the time that you kill the last monster. Your second option in the belt slot is to use the Parandus Blazon, which simply gives you 8% increased item quantity at its top end roll. That's pretty nice, but it's again another budget option. Both the Bisco's Leash as well as the Parandus Blazon are incredibly cheap options and are usually only a few chaos each. That being said, Parandus Blazon is almost always cheaper than the alternative, which is the Rampage Activator Bisco's Leash, because Bisco's, generally speaking, rises in price whenever we are entering into a league where players think Magic Find is going to be more meta. And thirdly, of course, you've got the ultimate option, which is the Headhunter. Believe it or not, some players don't like using Headhunters because they just don't enjoy it. Some players really like using Headhunters and they build their entire build around it. Headhunter is definitely going to be your most expensive option in terms of the belt slot, but it does make your build go ridiculously fast. Of course, all dependent on the particular rare mods that you steal from monsters. But just like Rampage gets you going the more you kill, Headhunter is an exponential version of that and gets you going even further and even faster, depending on how many rares you kill in a particular zone. Oftentimes when you're farming a particular zone that's got a boss included in it that you can scale up and continue to keep those rare mods rolling on your character, is something that becomes very, very trivial when you walk into the boss room and you've got a whole bunch of Headhunter buffs on you. Whereas if you're using a character that's using a Parandus Blazon, or if you're using a Bisco's, maybe it's reset, your Rampage stacks have actually reset, whereas your Headhunter buffs have got a much longer timer on them, and so that's an option for you if you're looking to farm something like, let's say, Burial Chambers, where you can, of course, kill the boss while you've also still got your Headhunter stacks up. In other instances where maybe the boss isn't necessarily in the same instance, the true instance of the rest of the map, then you're not going to be able to roll in with any kind of momentum whatsoever. And so if you're looking to kill bosses, that's something to take into consideration in your belt slot, whether or not it's worth your time to kill the boss, which most Magic Find users would say until you can just instantly delete them, it's not worth your time. So that's another discussion for another day. But those are your options in the belt slot. In the ring slot, we've got a couple of different versions or a couple of different options for us. The Pariah ring, which is what I personally use, it's what I personally go by when I am playing Magic Find characters. The Pariah ring gives you 15% quant in each ring if you've got a white socket in that particular ring. Now, these aren't usually cheap. That's why I haven't said either of these are really budget rings, but there is one that's definitely more budget than the other. So the budget ring would be a Pariah that's going to give you that 15% quant, and it also gives you +2 to level of socketed gems. And because it is a white socket, you can socket whatever you want into those particular slots, and that's a nice way to just get 30% quant on your build by stacking 2 white socket Pariahs. All right, but enough of those budget items. Let's talk about the Dream. The Dream is getting a Ventur's Gamble that's got a perfect quant roll and a perfect rarity roll. And did I mention that Ventur's Gamble can actually roll 3 resistances? Now, here's the problem, and here's the reason why it's called Ventur's Gamble. Every single roll that you want to roll on it is variable, including positive and negative numbers. That's right, you can roll negative quantity or negative rarity or negative on the various resistances that this particular ring will roll. So don't think that Ventur's Gamble is going to be something that is cheap in any particular meta that is going to find itself anywhere close to being attractive to Magic Find players. Magic Find players are actively hunting for the best versions of Ventur's Gambles out there, and Ventur's Gamble as an item can vary widely in its prices. We're talking anywhere from people are trying to give them away to people are spending hundreds of divines to try to get the perfect one for their particular setup. Next up in the Helm slot, there are options between Starconia's and Devoto's Devotion. Of course, Starconia's is great because it gives you dex, it gives you crit, it gives you life and attack speed, and it also gives a good amount of evasion if you're looking to stack up as much evasion as you can in order to go as fast as you can using Queen of the Forest as your chess piece. Devoto's Devotion, however, is usually a little bit more expensive than Starconia's. Both of them are relatively cheap, usually underneath 30C or so when they're on the top end of a particular league. So buying either of these isn't necessarily going to be an expensive option for you if you're looking at a Magic Find character to begin with. That being said, Devoto's does give you, on top of giving you dex, it also gives you similar evasion to Starconia's, and it's got a bonus built-in 20% movement speed in your Helm slot. So if you're just looking to go zoom as fast as you can, run around and blow things up with Wind Ripper and getting your freeze chains off, then Devoto's is clearly a better option than Starconia's. P.S. This also means if you're ever looking to farm the Labyrinth for Helm enchants, you should just pick up a Starconia's or a Devoto's and see if you can't slap on Tornado Shot on there, because that's going to be worth several Exalted in any kind of meta that has got a Magic Find theme for it. Well, fourthly, in your amulet slot, there is the budget version, which is the Karuai Ward, which gives you 10% move speed, 30% projectile speed, and 30% increased projectile damage. It is an incredibly cheap amulet. A lot of the times I find them like as I am leveling up through the first couple of acts. It's incredibly cheap. It's a very nice quality of life piece because we deal projectile damage, and of course we want as much move speed as possible, but it has absolutely nothing in terms of comparison as a Magic Find item to Bisco's Collar. Bisco's Collar gives us up to 150% increased item rarity versus magic enemies and 50% increased item quantity versus normal enemies. This is much tougher to roll on the top end because it's got a massive roll spectrum that you can get when you are using divines to roll a Bisco's Collar. But that being said, Bisco's Collar is the top end of unique amulets to use if you are looking to fill out and get as much top end increased item quantity as possible. Speaking of top end increased item quantity, what is the top end that you can get? Well, you can get 15% from Wind Ripper on frozen enemies, 15% from Greed's Embrace, 10% from Sadima's Touch, 20% from Goldworm, 50% from Bisco's Collar on normal enemies, 15% from one pariah, 15% from another pariah, 8% from a Parandus Blazon, and 18% from a Divination Distillate, meaning that your total IIQ on a frozen normal enemy while your flask is in effect is 166%. Now that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Magic Find. That's a lot of extra stuff that's going to drop, and that means the chances of you getting something good and valuable and worth your time farming are a lot higher. So I mentioned earlier that there are some leveling trees that are for your benefit here. I've put together just a couple of them. They basically fell out a spine. They take you all the way up into acrobatics, and then eventually in Act 3 and 4, they get you some crit and some damage. Eventually you get into Act 7 or so, you start filling out more damage, more life nodes, and then the option that you've got is either a 90 plus point version of a Raider, a Deadeye, or a Pathfinder. Now, my particular Magic Find character that is set up, that was featured in this particular gameplay footage, was set up on a Deadeye, and so this is what I've actually got on my particular character. You're actually going to start off by grabbing Gathering Winds. Gathering Winds gives you Tailwind, and it also gives you a whole bunch of evasion rating while you have Tailwind. And again, we're always trying to stack as much evasion rating as possible if we are using Queen of the Forest, because it gives us additional move speed. So this gives us a big bonus to our action speed, which is from Tailwind, and it gives us a big bonus to our move speed while we've got Queen of the Forest on. You're also going to want to grab Far Shot, which gives you Far Shot, and then 30% increased projectile speed. For those of you who don't know, Far Shot can give you up to 30% more damage based on the distance that you are, where the projectile that you fire is, up until the point where it actually makes contact with an enemy. It caps at 30% presently, that's where the numbers are, but that is a massive amount of damage that you can get into your build relatively early on. And since we're so squishy and since we don't have very many layers of defense, you want to stay as far away from enemies for the most part as possible anyway. So this plays into most of our gameplay style. Next up is Ricochet, which gives us skills chain 1 additional time, and projectiles deal 10% more damage for each remaining chain. This means if you support your main skill, like Tornado Shot, with another chain support, it means that you've got a more multiplier stacking on top of one another, giving yourself a big boost to your damage. If you even need to, you can go and grab Fast and Deadly, which gives you increased attack speed, increased projectile damage, as well as global accuracy rating, and then increased Blink Arrow and Mirror Arrow cooldown recovery speed, which is nice. But to be honest, the vast majority of the time, you're going to be moving a heck of a lot faster just by moving than you are by actually using Blink Arrow or Mirror Arrow. If you prefer to focus more on your flasks and you enjoy playing the piano or the banjo or anything that has to do with your fingers, then you're probably going to be more attracted to playing the Pathfinder version of this particular build. Now, a lot of players will say that you ought to be playing Deadeye because Deadeye's got Tailwind and it's just fastest overall. But the reality is that now that we've got Tailwind on boots available, thanks to the new Conquerors of the Atlas, you can get Tailwind on basically anybody. You can craft them. Now, this does mean you're giving up Goldworm, which is potentially 20% to your increased item quantity drops. So you're going to have to make a determination if it's worth it picking up Tailwind on a non-Tailwind granting ascendancy. But it is a very nice option because it means that you're not locked in to playing Deadeye. And if you'd rather play a Pathfinder or a Raider, you can. So this is a great debate amongst the Pathfinder community. And there's a lot of different builds out there that choose a lot of different options when they are leveling up and which order exactly they choose as they ascend. I personally go for Nature's Boon, which gives you 6% reduced elemental damage taken, and it gives you flask gain charges every 3 seconds, and there's a chance for your flask not to just consume charges. It's really nice as you're running throughout the leveling process. Some players choose to go Nature's Adrenaline instead, just because, again, it's nice throughout the leveling process to have 15% increased movement speed during any flask effect and 20% increased attack speed during any flask effect. Essentially, if you are double flasking your move speed flasks throughout the 10-act story campaign, you're going to go a lot faster, whether or not you're using Nature's Adrenaline or Nature's Boon. Either way is going to make you go faster. Next up is Master Alchemist, which gives you immune to elemental ailments during any flask effect. If you are league starting as a Pathfinder and then you're going to eventually turn your character into a Magic Find character, this is very, very nice because it means that early on in a league, you don't have to worry about rolling elemental immunity onto your various flasks. So it's quite nice to get this on top of the elemental immunity that you are granted while you're using a flask. You also get 40% increased elemental damage during any flask effect, and then 20% chance to freeze, shock, and ignite during any flask effect, which, remember how Wind Ripper kills enemies and grants us increased item quantity against frozen enemies? Yeah, so this is really, really helpful for a Magic Find setup. Next up is Veteran Bowyer. This gives you 10% of physical damage as extra damage of a random element. Damage penetrates 10% elemental resistances, and enemies you kill that are affected by elemental ailments grant 100% increased flask charges. So you really never have to worry about running out of flask charges, and you can just constantly keep playing the piano until your heart's desire, a headhunter or a doctor, drops for you. Last up for Ascendancy choices is, of course, the Raider. And on the Raider, one of the things that's most exciting about the Raider is, of course, Frenzy charges. And the entire tree for the Raider looks a little bit different because we go out of our way to pick up as many Frenzy charges as we possibly can. And it puts us up to around 7 or 8 Frenzy charges, depending on how you want to itemize. You can, of course, grant yourself some maximum Frenzy charges either through corruptions that you get on gear, or if you just like to craft it under rare gear yourself. So there's lots of different options for you if you choose to go Raider, in how you want to scale up the damage. I personally think that the damage is always going to be better on the Raider as opposed to our previous 2 Ascendancies that we went over the Pathfinder and over the Deadeye. However, the Pathfinder goes a little bit faster with the flask effectiveness, and the Deadeye is probably the most even keel across the board just because of the quality of life that Tailwind provides. And therefore, you can also use Goldworm in your boot slot rather than having to get Tailwind off of your boot slot by crafting. That being said, Raider does a ton of damage, and the way how you're going to want to actually play this particular Raider out is to grab Quartz Infusion, which gives you increased elemental damage and then gives you chance to dodge attack hits. And then you have phasing while you're at maximum frenzy charges. You have phasing during onslaught, and you gain phasing for 4 seconds on kill. So essentially, you're going to have phasing pretty much all the time, which is really nice as you are leveling up. It's also a good amount of elemental damage as you are leveling up throughout the 10-act story campaign. It means that you can level up doing basically anything that you want. You are not necessarily restrained to doing an attack-based build while you level up with the Raider because it's just increased elemental damage. So if you want to use an elemental spell, you can do that. Then we're going to come up and grab Avatar of the Veil, which gives us even more move speed while we are phasing. We're also going to be immune to elemental ailments while phasing. So again, we don't have to worry about piano flasking all the way throughout the 10X story campaign because we're immune to elemental ailments while we're phasing. We're basically phasing all the time. There's also a 10% chance to dodge spell hits while we're phasing, and then nearby enemies have fire, cold, and lightning exposure while you have phasing, which applies minus 15% to those resistances. That actually becomes a massive more multiplier if you get enemies into negative resistances, which is quite nice. Nearby enemies then also have 15% less accuracy rating while you have phasing, so again, there's even less chance of you getting hit if you were relying on acrobatics or phase acrobatics. So you're adding additional layers to your defensive mechanisms like acrobatics to make sure that you don't get hit, and if you would get hit, you're making sure that you really won't get hit. For your last 2 labyrinths, you're going to want to go with Way of the Poacher, which of course, the biggest part of this is that it's going to give you an additional maximum frenzy charge, but then on top of that, it gives you increased attack speed, it gives you 20% chance to gain a frenzy charge on kill. That's, please note, that's just on any kill, just on against anything. So it doesn't have to be unique, doesn't have to be rare. As soon as you kill anything, there's your frenzy charge generation. On top of that, you get another 20% chance to gain a frenzy charge when you hit a rare or unique enemy. So if there's rares or uniques, or even if you're in a boss room and you're not killing anything, as long as you're hitting a unique enemy, you've got a 20% chance to gain frenzy charges. And lastly, we round out the Raider Ascendancy by grabbing Avatar of the Slaughter, which we've got a bunch of frenzy charges at this point in time, and we're getting 8% increased evasion rating per frenzy charge, 3% increased movement speed per frenzy charge, 3% increased attack speed per frenzy charge, and 8% increased attack damage per frenzy charge. This is a massive amount of quality of life to this particular character, but it's not necessarily make or break, so that's why we save it for Uberlab. Ideally, for your gems, you're going to be operating on either a 4 or a 5 link early on until you get yourself your 6 link, and you're going to be using probably Tornado Shot along with Mirage, Archer, Greater Multiple Projectiles, Elemental Damage with attacks, and then Chain or Fork, depending on which Ascendancy it is that you went and whether or not you've got a Ringwald's Quills yet or not. Of course, I have to give a shout out to anybody in Standard. If you're playing in Standard, you can go get increased item quantity, which, yes, I've got one of these. This gives you another 39% quantity dropped by enemies slain from supported skills. This is a legacy skill gem. You can't get it inside any kind of leagues. So this is just me saying, hey, if you play Standard and you want to magic find your way to something that will boost your magic find even more, that is an option for you in Legacy. Your Herald of Ice ideally is going to be set up on a 5-link with either Onslaught, Assassin's Mark, Ice Bite, and Curse on Hit. The idea here is that as you are killing stuff with Herald of Ice, you are going to be able to proc and then proliferate out massive chain freezing that will kill everything via freeze. That's going to be the key part of this particular build because 15% of our increased item quantity is actually coming from freezing enemies. So anything that we can do to increase our chance to freeze against enemies is going to be very, very helpful in this particular build configuration. Last up, that's going to be really key, is going to be Vol Grace. This is really, really nice just to keep up all the time to make sure that you never, ever get hit by any enemies. You're not going to reserve your mana using Grace. You're just going to be using this for the Vol Grace side of things. We are reserving our mana for Herald of Ice as well as Hatred. Both Grace and Hatred, by the way, can go inside your pariahs if you're dual wielding those pariahs. So that's quite nice because you'll get a bonus 2 levels for each of those socketed gems in their respective pariahs. For our golem in this particular build, we're going to use the Ice Golem because this particular golem is going to grant us additional accuracy as well as increased critical strike chance. And so any chance that we've got to crit is a better chance to freeze, and any chance to freeze, of course, plays back into the utilization of the Wind Ripper. Well, thanks so much for watching today's video and discussion. I hope you all will join and participate in the discussion down below in the comments, and I look forward to reading and interacting with each and every one of you. I'm sure I've made tons of mistakes in this particular discussion as we go over the Magic Find archetype. There are dozens of ways to play a Magic Find character, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to chat about it and feature it in this particular series, because there's a lot of different ways that you can play this. There's a lot of different iterations of Magic Find, and this is just one of the ways that I personally have experienced and had a great time playing Path of Exile by using Magic Find on multiple different Ranger ascendancies. So go out there, find yourself whatever it is that your heart desires by killing enemies with as much increased item rarity or quantity as you so choose. And I hope that today is the day while you're playing a Magic Find character that you find yourself a Mirror of Calandra.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.